Welcome everybody to War, Revolutions and Terror. The lecture might go a reasonable amount longer today because I do wish to get to the end of the French Revolution section, because you do have your first piece of assessment due. I think it's the 15th of April. You can check that. That's on your course guide, unit information guide. I will say it here. I will send out an email also about this, but the aim of that exercise is to see whether or not you've been paying attention to the lectures. And if you have, and you do a good job of showing that, then you will do very well in that part of the course. Or if you've also shown that you've read well, you will also do well. If you show that you've done both, that'll be even better. As I say in the unit outline, I'm not looking for these to be mini essays. You've got 3 questions. Each answer should be about 400 words. I want you to put your answer in your own words. It's to show me words. It's to show me that you're not just capable of looking in Wikipedia, but that you are capable of thinking through the questions and coming up with a coherent answer. Give me an opportunity to see if there's also problems of understanding things and problems of expression, which you might need to work upon with your writing. Okay, but it's not a mini essay. I don't want quotes from things unless it's just a couple of sentences. If you do quote anything, then of course you need to directly, then of course you need to provide a reference. But in general, I'm not expecting to see references because I'm not expecting to see quotes. Okay, what we've done so far in terms of the French Revolution is we've looked at the long fuse, so bits and pieces of its long history. And if you recall from the beginning of the course, one of the important things I've been at pains to point out, and this will also be very pertinent in the case of the Russian Revolution, is that the kind of social formations that triggered the French Revolution, that were seen as obstacles of the French Revolution, and in fact are seen as a kind of tomb of history from which the people had to break through, all had developed for very strong historical reasons and had a lot to do with the way in which pre-modern social organization operates. And you will recall that's because war is at the center of life, agrarian food production is at the center of life, and a warrior class that is capable of protecting that group, plus a priest class that is able to, in a sense, mediate the people with their gods. So as you can see the way I'm formulating this is a very archaic way of just depicting the basic social formations, which the people in the 18th century were still very much heirs to. Now, there have been all sorts of things that happened in the development of Western Europe and the re-urbanization and intensification of urbanization of Western Europe in around the 12th century, we could say, and from then on. But nevertheless, what we could discern as being the way in which power was allocated and distributed, the way in which it was formed, the way in which authority worked with the 3 estates. And you recall the job of the parliaments, and you recall the role of the clergy and the role of the aristocracy, essentially initially as a military formation, as a military group, military caste, I should say, so in which family matters, to becoming something that people could buy their way into, because this enabled them to get all sorts of privileges and benefits by doing certain tasks in the society. And it was this combination of aspirations for new financial opportunities, a breakdown of the financial system because that had really fallen into dysfunction, the increasing ambitions of people in an environment where there were more and more professional classes seeking better opportunities in the cities. All of this is contributing to this breaking out that is the revolution. And at the same time, we see really quite different senses of wrath and anger and irritation, or just sheer violent behaviour, that all become folded into this thing we're calling the French Revolution. So that's a kind of sum up to this point. Then we also went through the different phases of the revolution, and then what I was doing towards the end of the lecture last week, and which I'll initially now carry on doing for a while, I was talking about some of the more notable players or groups that are referred to in the revolution, which I did refer to in the earlier lectures, but which I just want to fill out a bit more flesh. I realise in a lecture that the complexities of these characters are really simplified. They have to be. I'm giving you like a cartoon sketch. One of the things that I've said to you about the French Revolution, it is a revolution in which personality does play a very big role, but there's so many personalities involved in the revolution. You recall me also saying that there's a theatrical dimension to the revolution, which is kind of prepared for culturally by the role that theatre is playing, by the importance of public rhetoric that's playing not only in the law courts but also on the public stage in terms of creating a new way of doing politics. Again, that's based upon another cultural contextual element, and that is the importance. I don't know. I'm trying to get rid of this. Sorry. Another cultural important context is the way in which Roman Republican ideals had been circulated in the school curriculum, and so there's a whole generation of relatively young people. They're not all young people, but a lot of the people involved in the French Revolution are really quite young. Robespierre is in his early 30s by the time he's executed. Saint-Just is also an important player, mid 20s. Danton very young, and so on. So, but they've been schooled a certain way, and that schooling is one in which they identify with something very archaic, very ancient. It doesn't really have a lot to do with the actual conditions under which France was then operating, but which in their minds it does. So what they, in a sense, they create something in their own mind more akin to that ancient world. And indeed, there was a real fascination. I'll just say this: the way in which that fascination with the pre-Christian Roman Republic is played out is through. You can see it in some of the paintings, say, of Jacques-Louis David. You can see it in the various ceremonies and in the great mass celebrations that are politically orchestrated. By the way, in terms of that, those public orchestrations of mass participation will be something that will be replicated by both the communists and by the National Socialists. And you will recall me saying again that the French Revolution contains all the ideological elements of modernity, including the militarism that will be part and parcel of the National Socialists, as well as the idealism and party totalitarianism, which is not only the National Socialists but also part of the communist idea, and the idea that all of society can ultimately be orchestrated towards specific goals that a group of people, essentially a party, is able to dictate. This idea has enormous consequences for the framing of the modern mind when it comes to the discussion of politics. So, these personalities, and again, I would just draw your attention back to Beaumarchais' claim or statement in the marriage of Figaro that the aristocrats, it basically says, your day has come. From now on, it's only men of talent and merit and men of genius who will have real authority, who should be rewarded socially. You should not be rewarded socially just because of what you were born into. Privilege is something you must earn. Status is something you must earn. It's a very meritocratic ideal. But of course, that there's a kind of conscious forgetting there that that's what aristocracy was originally. Aristocracy was originally something that you achieved because of your military prowess. So you had the merit, and then the privileges accrued to you and then onto your family. But of course, over time, your capacity within the family, even though in many ways the aristocratic consciousness sees itself as cultivating the specific virtues that are required for the perpetuation of that social placement, requires that people are educated into that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it happens, and in fact it doesn't happen, of course. So that's when Beaumarchais is attacking that, because it's kind of moved into dysfunction. Again, to repeat the point I had made much earlier, one of the reasons it's causing revolution is a set of social layers have lost their primary reason for being, and other participants in the society see that they need some other way of having their talents, their aspirations, their view of reality, their economic agency better rewarded. Whether or not this actually completely delivers is an open question, but in some ways, let's just cut to the chase. Yes, ultimately it does, insofar as the basic template for modern social formation is really being cast here in the French Revolution. But, as I've also said to you before, that doesn't mean it's problem-free. And we will see that the more the ideals of the revolution are articulated, the more we can see they rub against the grain and point actually to very serious problems in our modern society. So a question like, should the French Revolution have happened, for me, is an imbecilic question. And the same will be for the Russian Revolution. That's just, what is the point of asking that question? It happened. So now we can see what its various merits and demerits were, for sure, who the winners and who the losers were, for sure. But to try and treat this as if these processes were purely the outcome of what people's intention was is quite silly, because the thing that comes through in both these revolutions is intention has to do with the way the actors participating in the event spoke about it. It had to do with that. But the actual responses, the actual dynamics, that starts to leap out far beyond intention, so that those intending to bring about a far more just society, a more democratic society, a more liberated society, here I'm thinking the French Revolution, a more communist kind of society in the case of the Russian Revolution, well, they're playing catch up with reality, and all these modulations and adaptations of their ideals are happening on the fly, and what you see is reality of what you've got. Okay. So, what I've just said then, I think is a good way to segue into this next group, the Girondins, that we will talk about. They were basically the losing faction. They were the losing faction. And for a time, Jacques-Pierre Bousseau, like so many other figures, was a major figure in the revolution. He was a great orator. He had written an anti-slavery tract, he founded the group, but done pamphlets on this. He was a journalist. He had written works in philosophy of law. He was a law clerk. He had been imprisoned in the Bastille for pornographic work directed at Marie Antoinette. And he was a very eloquent speaker, but he would end up being the leaders of the Gironde and end up losing his head. Now, also note, as I'm running through some of these figures, and some I'll pause upon more than others, one of the reasons I've selected these figures is not only some of the more well-known ones, but the thing I've focused upon is very often their profession, because that's what I want you to notice, that these are often lawyers or journalists or in some way literati, men of science. They might be men of medicine. Occasionally you'll find a merchant. But in the main, they're professionals. And it's the professional class, the role that they play in the revolution, and what the revolution is, how it's ultimately constructed to suit their interests. So they do it in the name of the people. And you will recall me saying France is predominantly agrarian society. What we see here, and what I've been emphasizing all the way through, is here we see the elite nature of the political authority. And to reiterate, if there's one book, I think I said this in an early lecture, if there's one book that I think is indispensable work for doing political science well, and the word political science is a problem term, I realise that, but this I think is the kind of knowledge that you need for politics. It's Gaetano Mosca's The Ruling Class, Gaetano Mosca, M-O-S-C-A. And the reason I mention this is because he realises and argues in a way that very few others do. Marx Karl Marx that is, does it when he's talking about some groups, but he fails to realise that this is going to be a problem within socialism and communism, insofar as we can talk of Marx's view of communism and actual communistic states having any kind of congruence, which is not unproblematic, but it's not completely wrong. Let me discuss that in much more detail later, but he doesn't consider that problem, whereas Mosca thinks of this all the time. So when we're talking about the French Revolution, a revolution in which the people are valorized as God, you remember me talking about Klootz using that formulation that the people are God. This is really in disjuncture with, or in contradiction to, the fact that we see these different elites and different personalities, the different geniuses, so to speak, of the revolution come into prominence and then fade, and very often their fading is done with the blade. You know, they have their heads chopped off very often. Okay, so the Girondins, very important group who, very quickly, they rise to prominence. They're more radical than the previous, the previous set of alliances that had formed the constitution. The Girondins emerge with their own program, but they also emerge as not radical enough. Not radical enough in terms of the Montagnards. And their members, apart from Rousseau, Ducos, who was a philosopher, man of letters, background in commerce, anti-clerical, voted for the death of the king. Again, that didn't save him. See, part of the mythology of the French Revolution is the Girondins were the supporters of the king because they wanted an appeal to the people. This is not true. This is really not true. And again, look, if you look at the Rousseau, he's doing pornographic works, viciously attacking Marie Antoinette. So, and I'll just come back a step too in the earlier phase of the revolution. You'll recall me saying that what is set up is a constitutional monarchy. So characters like Lafayette and Mirabeau dies shortly, well, within a year, 18 months or so of the revolution. And he ends up trying to save the constitutional monarchy. And Lafayette, also, he gets caught up in having troops fire upon the mass of people at the Champ de Mars, and he too would like to see a constitutional monarchy, because basically, given the past, given what they've inherited, that would be the most troubleless way of creating the transformation which were necessary in their mind to having a more modern France, having a France more representative of the interests of its people, but one in which its traditions weren't completely overthrown. Though, as I say that, I should also say Mirabeau was very anti-clerical, and the role of the attacks upon the church played a very big part in Louis's decision to flee with Marie Antoinette and when they get caught up in Varennes, and then they get frog marched back, and ultimately the crown, both the king and queen, become imprisoned and they get executed. So the Gironde were not simply like the monarchians of the first phase of the revolution. Many of them, as I said, were quite radical. So but they tended to be federalist. They tended to oppose the centralization of French power within Paris. And this disjuncture between what the Parisians, you will recall again, the crowd in Paris. It's not the crowd acting elsewhere doesn't occur or doesn't matter. It does. But the crowd in Paris is very much dictating national policy of the day. So Paris sees itself as the centre of a unified nation, and in many ways it sees itself as the brains trust. And of course this creates resentment, whereas the Girondins, most of the representatives come from outside Paris, and this brought them into conflict with the Parisians. In the case of Vergniaud, he had called for war against Austria, as had Brissot. He had recommended suspension of the king after the storming of the Tuileries. He turned away the petition of the Paris sections wanting to overthrow the monarchy. He had denounced the September massacres, and this tended to be something as well. You'll recall the September massacres were when the Parisian crowd went in, and they were urged on by Danton in this respect, and other members of the different clubs in Paris, including Desmoulins, both of whom would be executed, as you will recall. They went in looking basically for any aristocrats and clergy to kill, and they just killed anyone that happened to be in prison was very likely to be killed. It was a horror, and for many people, this was a symptom of where the revolution could be heading if it didn't come back under the auspices of the rule of law. When we look more closely at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Constitution of 1791, we will also see that the importance of the rule of law is why you could be a revolutionary and a constitutional monarch, because even the king would be beholden to law. The idea is, and it has a very ancient pedigree, to some extent it's even a republican pedigree that is going way back to the Romans, and that is law is king, because law is the expression of the public good. That is the ideal formulation of what it is. So he too was guillotined. Another one quite famous I mentioned in passing is Condorcet. Condorcet was a very famous philosopher, very much in the Enlightenment tradition, an important figure in the development of social science. And then two others, the Roland, this married couple. At one stage, Madame Roland, both of them would be guillotined. Madame Roland had actually saved the life of Robespierre, but it didn't help her when push came to shove in the conflict between the Montagnards, and the Gironde. So I hope you're getting the picture, or I want to convey the picture of this kind of storm of panic and decisions being made very much on the fly, and what today is an acceptable and indeed consensual position, tomorrow falls out of favour, and another group who may have been opposed to that or those decisions, or may have even been in on the decisions, start looking for reasons why they want now to move beyond that, to move into a different phase of action or undertake a whole new range of actions, and they see that other group as a wall, in a sense, in their way. So they want to knock down that wall, and that means kill them. They need to get rid of them. And what has happened, and it was slow to happen because it's not as if this had immediately happened in terms of the governance of the revolution, but you will recall right from the days of fear, or the big panic of that period called the fear, what's happening in the countryside. I hadn't mentioned, but I will just mention briefly, in Grenoble, it's called a Day of the Tiles. This is very early. This is a trigger point, flash point of the revolution, when representatives of the Parliament and the Crown find themselves in conflict, and all these people are throwing tiles and hurling tiles, and some people get killed in that. There's the storming of the Bastille, and then by the September Revolution, we're seeing, September Massacre, we're starting to see, or you could say on the other side, the reaction of the soldiers under Lafayette and Bailly to the people of the Champ de Mars, we start to see this intensification of the scale of violence, and it's become factored in. And in the case of the September Massacre, as I said, it's partly now being played by those in government, are governing the revolution, steering the revolution. So, in a sense, you could say the moment of the terror, and the way we now, think of the Girondins mainly as the victims of the terror. That's now how, after the revolution has played out, we see them retrospectively in terms of their fate. We see that they had been on that side which was just seen as no longer having a future. And they too, this was the point I wanted to make, they had become victims of a violence that had become concentrated into the very center of the state, which had paradoxically, as we will see when we look at the 1793 Constitution, had become far more popular based in terms of its formulations about its existence, but in fact far more dictatorial than anything that had preceded it. In fact, that the most dictatorial phase of the revolution would be in the terror. So, but the Gironde had already in many ways been part of that storm of accumulating violence that would ultimately lead to the terror. And then, as we will see, the violence would relatively dissipate internally, domestically, but if anything, it will be intensified in terms of the externalities of the revolution, because the French Revolution had created internally essentially a police state armed camp, and then externally it would take that warring armed camp, it would create this great military machine and want to bring all of the world, insofar as it was able to, into its orbit. This was the logic of the revolution. So when we talk about the Gironde, and this is one of the really important things to keep in mind with any revolutionary process, when it's like you get on this great big, and in fact both your participation in the event is what's driving the dynamics forward of this machine-like process, and there's simply no way off. There's no way out. The momentum is so great that your attempt to stop it or to get off is invariably death. Some actually, it's just exile or escape, but in the main, it's death. It's to put it another way, you've participated in creating this momentum, and now you're sacrificed to the momentum. Well, coming back to more broad things about the Girondin, they'd call for a preventative war against Austria-Prussia. I had mentioned before, this had been opposed by Robespierre. So they were a pro-war party. So they've been party to, this is confirming what I was just saying, they've been part and parcel to that placing France in the position of having to be an armed camp, a military machine. And it would become the greatest military machine on land in Europe, in the world, in fact. They were vocal critics of the monarchy. They did generally, they weren't happy about the September massacre. They saw this as getting out of hand. They had tried to get Marat imprisoned. That failed. Marat, you will recall, was the guy that was killed by Charlotte Corday, who had been a supporter of the Gironde, coming from the countryside. She comes from the countryside. So she sees Marat, who's writing these blood-curdling pamphlets calling for the hundreds of thousands of people to be killed for the revolution. This is the only thing that could save the revolution. It's only through sacrifice and blood, sacrifice of all the betrayers of the people, of all the enemies of the people, that the revolution can be saved. So the Gironde start to react against this. They want to put a break on this violence, but as I said, they've been part and parcel of it. Generally, when it came to the monarchy, they wanted an appeal to the people. Some of them voted for execution, some against, but in the main, it appealed to the people. Another, they oppose the setting of grain price. Now, this is very understandable. They're primarily federal, they're coming from outside. I raised this before. People in the city want the food supply to be easy, and you'll recall all these riots are happening in Paris prior to and even at various stages during the revolution because of lack of grain. And this leads to baker shops and various other places where food might be seen as hoarded being stripped bare, people being killed, their places being looted. It's kind of chaos. The Gironde are basically thinking as economists, and they're basically saying, look, that you've got to pay the price that it is. Otherwise, people won't grow the grain. And if people grow the grain and you don't give them the price they want, then, well, they won't do it anymore. This is their thinking. It's very, basic economics 101, supply and demand thinking. But the panic in the cities means that if you're in any way, shape or form from the city representing the city's interests, you want that price to be low or stable. You want to make sure you can get access to bread. They also oppose the setting up of the revolutionary tribunal, and in a sense that setting up of that tribunal would be the end of it. That would bring about their demise. They were closely associated also, and this was a kind of act of misfortune, to a character called General Dumouriez, who was quite a famous general and aristocratic general who defected to the Austrians. This was huge scandal. And so anyone who was associated with him, and because the Girondins had supported the war against Austria and Prussia, and then a leading general defects to them, that reflects very badly on them. I had mentioned that they had sought the indictment of Marat. Marat was acquitted. They had also arrested Hebert. You will recall me saying Hebert was the major player in the more radical de-Christian, anti-Christian, basically atheist wing of the Montagnards, and Robespierre would turn against Hebert, as well as Jean Monnet. They had been proscribed from the National Assembly. Some joined the Federalist Revolt. In fact, quite a number did. After the assembly had been surrounded by 80,000 sans-culottes. So again, the mob had been used against the Parisian mob had been used against the Gironde. So I've talked about this squat before. I'll just quickly run the Montagnards. This is often considered where we get the terms left and right from. They, even though they sat on the high benches looking down, they would ultimately be seen as the group on the left of the forum in which the assembly had been laid out, and then they also controlled the National Convention. As I said, they were relatively young. They uniformly, in fact, in some ways, they were much more conscious of themselves as a political party than the Gironde. I think the Gironde was a kind of default group, but whereas the Montagnards, although they'd been closely associated with the Jacobin Club, although so had many of the Girondes, not all of them were Jacobins, but they had a support base in Saint-Cloud in Paris, and they basically ended up controlling the convention and the Committee of Public Safety. But that only lasted as long until there were cracks that the terror brought out within that group, because a number of members of the Montagnards were seeing that it wasn't too long before they would be killed. They'd see Danton, Desmoulins, a number of other major figures in the revolution executed by their own faction. And as I said, the strength of them gaining power had been their uniformity of purpose. When that started to crack and they start to turn on each other, it's all up. They had supported the revolutionary tribunals. Sorry. Yeah, that's misleading. They had supported the revolutionary tribunals. The Montagnards were also sending out men on missions to the various locations in the provinces. So they were really a number of their leading figures were essential to creating a kind of line of an alignment of purpose between the provinces and Paris. So they were reporting back on what was happening, going there, often taking soldiers with them, and looking for recruits there. So that was very strategically smart, and ultimately helped consolidate their power. They would pass the law of suspects, leading to the Committee of Public Safety, which would be the centerpiece of the terror. Now, the Committee of Public Safety, sorry, that's covered there, but this was the centerpiece of the terror. Originally, there had been 9 members, so it was the executive power of French government from 1793 to October 1795. The important thing about this is 93 or 94. Let me get back to that. I've got a feeling I've made a mistake there. I get confused on dates, and I can't believe I look over things. So just a minute. I want to check this. This is really driving me crazy. Hang on a second. I've just got a momentary block about dates. I hate this. Might be a second. Do forgive me. Yeah, it's 1794. I knew that was wrong as soon as I saw it. So forget that date. It's not 1795. It's 1794. Okay. Originally, there had been 9 members who met in closed sessions. And Danton would be one of the original members, along with Barrère. Cambon. Again, lawyers and journalists. Danton was a lawyer. Cambon, businessman, son of a cotton merchant. Danton will be replaced by Robespierre and then eventually overthrown or executed by Robespierre. So then it was a committee of 12. The thing was, now they really overrode every other governmental authority. But in essence, they were the government. They nominated the generals who oversaw the war ministries. They abolished other ministries, and they nominated their members to oversee various committees. And they were the group that had the authority to issue arrest warrants. And this, in fact, the arrest warrant would be the most important card in the pack, so to speak. That's what government had turned into. It was basically now a police state of a surveillance state in which anybody could dob in anyone who was seen in any way, shape or form as being a counter-revolutionary. And when, as I said, you've got someone like Danton being considered as a counter-revolutionary, when Danton's all protocols around proper trials have now been dispensed with, you see that this Committee of Public Safety, all justified on the basis of terror is needed to make the revolution survive, all justified on the fact that we are surrounded by our enemies. Our enemies are internal and external. We must save the revolution at all costs. But in fact, of course, what's going on is all the principles upon which the revolution is built have been sacrificed by the very attempt to keep power. In some ways, in fact, I would say not in some ways, it's just a fact. Very similar in the Russian Revolution in many ways. The more imperiled your abstractions are, the objectives you wish to actualize, but you've only thought of them in a very abstract way. They're principles, so to speak. They're principles and formulations of behavior in which they haven't really been tested in human hearts, people's genuine, willing commitments to conform their behaviors to these abstractions and principles, elements, that these, when they take on a life of their own, inevitably require that the group that is most committed to them has to start persecuting others that aren't committed to them. And it ends up being always a minority versus a majority. That it's the minority who are willing to push so far ahead, they end up having so much blood on their hands that eventually, well, they may have, you know, the French Revolution, they were lucky in a way, people in France were lucky in a way that this group was only in power a short time. When we look at the Russian Revolution and we think of how long Stalin was in power, hell, that was a lot longer. And then even in the aftermath of it, the dictatorial nature of that kind of regime lasted much longer than the French Revolution. Okay, it would also find itself in a collision course with the Committee of General Security, and it was this committee that a number of their members would turn against Robespierre. Now, I've mentioned Robespierre, the lawyer from country who was like a shadow player in the revolution, who had justified terror, who was a great orator in terms of precision, who's had a magnetic kind of personality in terms of the striking austerity of what he stood for and how he presented himself. Very different to Danton, who was this great, effusive, bombastic, man of the people type, all very beautifully conveyed, I think, in the Baidu review, which I mentioned to you last week. Let's go through some of the others very quickly. Barrère, who was in charge of education, social welfare, diploma, he was exiled. Saint-Just, the young, he was a writer, had been a law student, poet. I've mentioned before, really, his writings, I think, are really psychopathic. If you might read a book by a man called Talmud. and it's called The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. And there's a very elaborate and insightful discussion of Saint-Just there. He was in his mid-20s by the time he was dead, and he was responsible for war planning. But he was really, and perceived to be, the lapdog of Robespierre. Then there was Georges Couthon, a lawyer. He was, again, part of the Robespierre faction, in charge of political policy and policing. Robert Linday, he ultimately distanced himself from Robespierre. He had participated in the attempt to kind of have a coup by a socialist group led by a guy who called himself Gracchus Babeuf. The group was called the Conspiracy of Equals, so they were more radical left, socialistic, a very early pioneering group of socialists, but he was ultimately acquitted for that. And indeed, he returned during the Directory and during the Napoleonic time, to hold a ministry. He had sided, though, in deciding to kill Danton. So in that sense, he had sided with Robespierre, even though he didn't generally support Robespierre faction. Another, Lazare Carnot, war minister, war strategist, mathematician, physician, again would turn against Robespierre. He would become a member of the Directory, like Linday, and also had appointed Napoleon General Chief of the Army in Italy, and he served in Napoleon's 100-day government. So one of the things you're seeing here is some of the people that managed to escape with their lives, they would keep coming back into the political fray. And that's really quite fascinating. As I said, Lafayette and Talleyrand would still be political players in 1830. And in the case of Lafayette, he had to abscond from France during the height of the revolution, even though he'd been a major player performer in the early moments of the revolution. Another one was Saint-André. He had come from a Protestant family, had become a Protestant pastor who was responsible for naval affairs, often on missions. He had made the basic flag, the national anthem, and the national flag of France. Again, he was arrested but given amnesty, and he'd become a diplomat. Prieur, another lawyer, he had been in charge of missions to the army, active in the execution of the Vendée rebels. In fact, he played a big part in that. And he too was part of Napoleon's 100-day government. Prieur Duvernois, military engineer. He had introduced uniform standard of weights and measures in France, responsible for arms and procurement, gunpowder manufacturing. De Seychelles, again, a very major figure. He was guillotined along with Danton and Desmoulins. Had been a king's attorney, a diplomat. Varenne, another lawyer, wrote a comedy. You know, lawyer, authors. Was teacher, exile, Desbois, exiled to French Guiana, like Barrère and Varenne. Okay, so that, as we said last week, the days of Thermidor ultimately brought in a new constitution. I just a new kind of political formation. This was the Directory. It succeeded the National Convention. It ruled for basically 4 years. It was replaced by a consulate, then Napoleon's coup, and created a bicameral legislature. Some of the things that I think are interesting here is that here we start to see age restrictions. So someone like Saint-Just couldn't have been possibly on this council no matter what their politics were. So, and basically this is a return to a more aristocratic way of doing politics. So it's far less manifestly democratic, and it's seeking to concentrate the number of representatives in a way that provides stability. And the whole purpose of the Directory is to find a more stable form of governance, and the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients and this bicameral legislature is a way of trying to do the opposite of what the the uniformity that was required by, no, let me put that another way, the dictatorial nature of the government that had come through the Committee of Public Safety. You can see this is really the antithesis of that. Again, older, hoping wiser, and more and more constraints. They had to be married or widowed and resident in France at least for 15 years. Again, very specific criteria. So what we're saying is we want people who've shown a very specific character, because one of the things that comes out of the French Revolution is it just seems like anybody at any time, a raging psychopath like Saint-Just or Marat, I think both of them are really psychopathic characters, or Jacques Roux, another one. The orators, blood-curdling appeals to the people. This is an attempt to put an end to all that. This is an attempt to bring stability. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to look at some of the constitutional features of the revolution in a little bit more detail. So the different phases of the revolution, as we saw with the Directory, as we see with the rise of the Montagnards against the Girondins, and initially with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then the Constitution that emerges from this, what we see is the different constitutional formulations, and I'm going to concentrate on the first two. They really bring out, sometimes in quite subtle ways, features of the revolution at the different, that you're consistent with the different phases of it. So, and we recall, let's go back a step and recall that very early in the revolution, one August night, the whole system is ripped up in rhetoric. It's rhetorically ripped up as all feudal privileges are overthrown, which meant all the, and privileges of nobility. It meant that the whole way in which political authority had previously been exercised, apart from the crown, and economic privilege had been gained, or largely, not exclusively, but largely had been gained. This was now all going to stop. It would take a while to do this, but what is also happening at the same time is that there's a set of principles that this is seen as being consistent with. So one of the things about the revolution, not only it's a theatrical performance, it's not only it's a group of certain social group becoming elites, the elite representatives or the elite within the social body by gaining political office, but that elite ensconces its power through the development of narratives which ostensibly affect everybody, appeal to everybody, so not just affect, but appeal to, and ostensibly also come from the interests of everybody, so that their social position as governors and the position of those who are governed is basically blurred in this rhetorical identification of them with the people. And what we will see, and what we have seen indeed, is that that blurring is actually an obfuscation, because that's not how it works. That's not really what happens. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which comes out of ideas which have a pedigree in the enlightened philosophers. So those philosophers who understanding of the world was such that they saw that if we could get our moral principles right, make the world fit our moral principles, then the world would be good. Then everything we want would happen. And what did they want? Well, the committee assembly, which included, it was proposed by Lafayette, it included Mirabeau, Monnier-Siey, remember the writer of the What is the Third Estate pamphlet. Mirabeau, of course, for a moment there, a major figure in the revolution, trying to save the constitutional monarchy, at the same time doing everything in his power to draw power away from the monarchy. Very canny figure, playing a double game, but he ends up dying early in the revolution, as I said. They emphasising liberty, equality of rights, sovereignty of the nation, the rule of law, the separation of powers, religious tolerance, and equity of taxation. So this is the abstraction. They would be revised in 1793, when right of resistance to oppression was emphasised, and in 1795, when that right was essentially removed. Now, I'll go into more details about this, but the first thing I want to say is we can see big difference that occurs between the Declaration of Rights of Man in 1789 and the Constitution of 1793 in the preambles. And this is very interesting. So just bear with me a moment, because I think this really gives you an insight into these subtle, well, ostensibly subtle transformations, which actually full of significance. And in saying this, I feel like a lawyer who's looking at every comma and every colon and saying that, oh, hell, if you use this word and not that word, this comma, not that comma, it has a whole different meaning. So that's why when people draft a will or certain documents, the letter really matters. And in a sense, I think the letter really matters in these constitutions. So the opening sentence of the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789 has it that the representatives of the French people, organised as the National Assembly, believe that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole cause of public calamities and of the corruption of government. Now, philosophically, that is just a nonsense. That is simply just a nonsense. And I'm not even going to elaborate upon that. I hope that you can see why, but it's saying that any problem that has led to a public calamity or corruption of government is because of the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man. One might argue that the attempts to incorporate the rights of man lead to public calamity and the corruption of government, and that is the story of the revolution. It is the opposite of what that says, because the attempts to wipe out the ignorance, neglect, contempt has actually consolidated people being contemptuous of those rights through dictatorial behaviour, thereby causing public calamity and the corruption of government. At the very least, what is noticeable about that, and what is philosophically deeply unsatisfying about that, is the hyperbole within which it's cast. It's not an attempt to, in a disinterested, dispassionate, reflective manner, try and identify all the things that are the cause of public calamity and corruption of government. If I wrote a book called A Treatise on Public Calamities and the Corruption of Government, I might start going into very many things. I might discuss things like the competence of governors and public officials, just merely their competence, the wisdom of the electorate or its lack thereof. And when I speak of the competence or incompetent, the education system, the quality of it, the way in which narrative is formed and circulated in the society. And as I would go into it further, I'd say, well, there's a whole lot of things that cause public calamities. But the idea that they would be avoided if we got all the rights right is simply pie in the sky. It's simply inflated rhetoric. It's simply abstraction gone mad. So that's, now, having said that, we'll see that in 1793, if anything, that rhetorical excess has been intensified. So it's building upon that, but it's not building upon it by having a closer look at reality and thinking, is this right or not? Again, it's caught up in the storm cloud of ideas. And as I said, what we'll see is the Constitution will become increasingly rights projected and increasingly, in a sense, big shot aspirations at the very moment where the violation of these rights had never been worse in France. Nowhere near as many people had died through the hands of the crown in even 100 or 200 years prior to the revolution, has died during the revolution, directly as a result of, government execution. It's incomparable. It'd be very similar when we get to the Russian Revolution. Look, in me saying this, it's not defending the old order, it's just simply drawing attention to facts. That one may end up saying that the French Revolution has all these goods that come out of it, and you might say that's undeniable. But in a sense, so what? That's not really the issue, as I said, because it's not like we're learning this in order to go and have another go at it. I think that's completely crazy. We're living in a completely different world. And any people that are calling for any kind of revolt today, well, we'll see, they usually have a very different set of concerns and priorities than those people involved in the French Revolution. We don't have a kind of obstructions to our ambitions as professionals that the French urbanites especially were facing. Anyway, this is what it says in 1793. The French people, not the representatives, of the French people, organised a national assembly. So at least in the 1789 declaration, you've got a separation between people, representatives, and assembly, and that recognition actually is an honest recognition. That, in fact, in that sentence I've given you, that's the only bit of the sentence that I think is well formulated, and it's well formulated because it indicates that a people and its representatives are not the same, and the assembly in which the representatives meet is also going to require some kind of, this is implicit in this, because in a national assembly you'll have different positions being to and fro and argued about. So there will be some, and here's the point I want to make, there will be a compromise. There's, in a sense, this declaration is more astute to the necessity of compromise in politics, where on the right, what you've got is the French people. It's unified, and as you will recall me saying earlier on, an intrinsic part of the narrative, of the rhetoric around the French Revolution is that the people who are valorized, and everything done by the terror is done to protect the people, only makes sense through its counter concept, which is the enemies of the people, which those people empowered, or those people who have usurped power in the Committee of Public Safety and their various instrumentalities, they dictate who belongs to the people and who is an enemy of the people. So, in point of fact, the disjuncture is more severe at the time of 1793, but the rhetoric is more holistic, uncompromising. Unity is what is emphasized here, as if the people could speak in a uniform manner, as if they could all speak with one voice, as if they all saw the public good in the same way, which is simply not true. So that means those people that claim to speak on behalf of the people will find an enemy anywhere that someone disagrees with their interpretation of what the people want. So they're convinced, the French people are convinced, that the forgetfulness and contempt of the natural rights of man are the sole causes of the miseries of the world, and they have resolved to set forth in the solemn declaration this sacred and inalienable rights. But of course, we'll see under the terror they were all too alienable. They weren't considered sacred. If you were considered the enemy of the people, all rights were gone. In part, we've already got the circumstance of the revolution. We've already got the circumstance of government and people, and the sovereign power is ultimately what dictates who has right. That's already in 1789, but as I said, it becomes intensified in 1793. They may never just allow themselves to be oppressed and debased by tyranny, and in order the people may have always before their eyes the foundation of their liberty and their welfare. The magistrates the rule of its duty to legislate the purpose of its commission. So here what we're saying is it is the job of the government to identify the liberty, to protect the liberty, and also to identify the people's welfare. So this, in some ways, you could say this is a leftward shift where public welfare now is considered the role of government. Previously, your welfare was your concern. It was up to you to do things that would provide for you, and that you could only do things, of course, insofar as the opportunities available to you were there. Now the idea, which is something that is a strong legacy of the French Revolution, the government has a responsibility in ensuring that people's welfare is preserved and protected. And the purpose of the commission of the legislator is to protect the liberty and the welfare of the people, which means you've identified what that public welfare is. It's all based around this idea that there is a general good, that general good is accessible through reason, and the people who occupy governance have the competence both to recognise what that good is and to deliver that good. And I'll come back to that position of competence, because one of the things that's very disconcerting about the rhetoric that comes out of the French Revolution, and indeed the rhetoric of so much politics today, and the kind of world in which we increasingly have people who want to be identified as leaders directing us through our education, leaders directing us through the kind of narratives that we may make or say, especially educational instruction, but not solely. Cultural leadership, we talk about this. Human resources and management, we talk about this. This kind of fascination or with leadership ultimately begs the very question, seems to me, a pre-political question, a non-political question, but an existential question. And it's a question about psychology and human capability. And that question is, how good is anyone at anything? How good is anyone at anything? Anyone that's had back pain, like I have a lot of my life, will know you can go to 100 chiropractors and you'll be lucky if you can find one or two that are any good. Or you can go to 100 doctors. And is politics somehow magically divorced from the fact that there's a biblical formulation for this? Many are called, but few are chosen. So many might do something, but how good are they? So the question of the quality of governance and how we would identify the character, and again, I'll just leap back to when I say character, when the greatest, in my opinion, of the ancient classical political thinkers, Aristotle, wrote his little book on the ethics and the politics. He emphasized that for government to be well conducted, the characters of the actors had to be their education, their character, their personal characteristics, their qualities, had to be cultivated in a certain manner. And what we can see is this way of talking. On the one hand, you can see there will be instruction, there will be educators. What will they do? They will educate in terms of rights. And there's the ongoing legacy of this kind of abstract way of dealing with things is very much in universities today. It's very much a continuation of this rights talk. And to put it another way, rights talk, but absence of character talk. Absence of character. Absence of talking about personal virtues. Robespierre talked all the time about virtue. All the time. It was ever on his lips. But if we use the term virtue in the Aristotelian sense, we would ask this very serious question: what kind of qualities enabled Robespierre to assure us that Robespierre's abilities were such that he would inevitably make wise, judicious decisions about political life? And the answer is, well, no one in the French Revolution thought about that. Some people wrote about his character, and obviously they were, in a sense, thinking he's hopeless, he's no good. But in terms of the public narratives at that time, that's not where the focus was, certainly with the supporters of Robespierre and even later. All that mattered were these principles. And this is the problem with any kind of politics of principle, that it ultimately requires us neglecting too much the character of circumstance and the character of the characters in their involvement and participation and response to circumstances. So it's a whole other narrative set of emphases, which, as I said, today in modern times, in literature, for example, it's so typical that one just looks at the gender, the class, or the race of the participants in a narrative or in any kind of event, and in a literary circumstance or in film or something like that. They're seen as representatives. This is very much a continuation of this line of thinking. And I think it's a very problematic line of thinking, and it's a line of thinking which burdens the modern. It's a great burden to the modern, because ultimately it's based upon something unreal. It's based upon a failure to connect people as they are, who they are, with the conditions under which they operate, and instead it has a substitute narrative. And that substitute narrative is one in which you emphasize structure, you may emphasize function, and you will emphasize ideological commitments, ideas, and principles, and you will look at everything through that. So in a sense, personality vanishes, character vanishes. But I'll just say one last thing on this. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was German, a witness to the French Revolution, like the revolutionaries, like Robespierre, was a great fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He says, and I think this formulation is very much how the French themselves, and Kant writes justifying the French Revolution, by the way, so he's an avid follower of this. But he comes up with a view of politics which is very much fits what the revolutionaries were trying to do, even though he's in Germany and they're in France. And he says, we must be able to come up with a constitution that would ensure harmony, even within a race of devils. That is what I think ultimately has been very much the legacy of the people of the the revolutionary tradition coming out of France, and intensified at its high point amongst the Montagnards and the Robespierrians. And there's one simple problem with that, is that the Constitution is meaningless without its enforcement. And are you saying that if there's a race of devils, it won't be a devil doing the enforcement? And the question, and again, he begs the question of capacity, of ability, of character. But it's part and parcel of very, very modern tendency to abstraction, and it'll be even more so when we get to the Russian Revolution and the intelligentsia of that generation. And in a way, this is of all the negative things, and I don't deny there are a number of positive things. I certainly agree with Beaumarchais, for example, that genius, if you have genius, it's recognised and you shouldn't be deprived of the goods that come your way through your prowess, and that it's prowess rather than birth rate should matter. Yeah, I go along with that. I'm not here to tell you, all the goods and bads of the revolution. You can figure that out. You can figure that out for yourself. But I just say one very negative quality that comes out of the revolutionary tradition of both the French Revolution and the Russian revolutions is a preponderancy towards abstraction. The willingness to let our abstractions dictate our assessment of things. Okay. Now, as I said, I do want to finish today. So the lecture will be a bit longer. I notice Claire has joined me. Hello, Claire. So I'm going to run through some of the different constitutional moments, but I want you to read these more slowly, because I want you to see what it is, what the rights are, the principles are that the politics is meant to introduce. That's meant to be 1789, not 1798. Okay. So, first of all, we see, the first declaration: men are born and remain free and equal in right. Social distinction may be based on any considerations of the common good. Here we have it: the common good, social distinction, the Beaumarchais position, the essential character, in the sense of the essential quality that was holding, in many ways, the aims and aspirations of the revolution together. In some way, shape, or form, this would be a principle of common appeal in the revolution, and would justify it. And the aim of every political association is preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man: liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression. The source of all sovereignty lies essentially in the nation. And let's jump to 5 now. The law has the right to forbid only those actions that are injurious to society. But that is ultimately going to mean who makes the law, how to identify what the injury to society is. It's not obvious. It's not obvious that what is injurious to society. For example, if I have a smoking ban, which many people think smoking is injurious to society, that's obvious. But if I ban people from smoking and I enforce that ban, and then people, in order to satisfy their craving for smoking, will break the law, I've actually created a law. Well, let's take something, not even smoking, let's just take something that people like doing. Though smoking is something a lot of people like doing. And so you introduce the law, but people don't really want to go along with it. What you've actually done, if they're willing to escape it, is you've created a law that creates lawlessness. You've created a law which you will then have to implement, which you'll then use resources to implement, in which those that don't go along with it are going to be imprisoned or fined, and a lot of your resources. And there's an opportunity cost in that. So any law, in a sense, has to be seen, whether it's smoking or censorship or whatever, has to be seen in the context of, and this is just one very elemental layer, the economics of the implementation of that and the opportunity cost involved in using your resources to do A rather than B. That's a very general but not insignificant thing that has to be considered. Now, when we get to, and then we get in our everyday situation, which is what the law courts are dealing with constantly. The neighbours squabbling over walls, neighbours squabbling over restrictions. There's a pub in town, and everyone goes there on a Friday night, and then for a new gentrified public start buying houses, apartments in the area, and then they want to close them down. They don't want the music to be playing at a certain time because that disturbs them. What's the public good to that? Which one is in the right? It's injurious to society. Look, that's the problem. The society is not a thing in and of itself. It's composed of membership and different interests within it. And there are some things that more or less we can kind of agree on generally are good for the society. It's good that people are educated, say, but then we have to agree on what the educational curriculum is. And then we start to find there's all sorts of conflicts going on. So, again, abstraction, abstraction, abstraction. But this society lies essentially in the nation. The real issue is that many things that previously government did not concern itself with, the state did not concern itself with, these kind of abstractions now become like all-seeing eyes, so to speak, in which so many things that were previously outside of the province of legislative concern become within the province of legislative concern. And so that then changes the nature. That can change the nature of human association. An irony of all ironies, at a moment when the pitch is for greater and greater liberty, you're now introducing a formation in which that liberty can be increasingly cut away at, increasingly cut off, increasingly eroded. And in fact, it may not be liberty that is holding this social good together, it's conformity. And again, we see that right before our eyes as the revolution develops in France, and the greater, the most emancipative, liberatory moment that you have with the 1793 Constitution is the moment of least freedom. And we will again see that with the Russian Revolution. So there's a dialectical aspect to all of this. It's very easy to ignore it, to overlook it, to be ignorant of it even. And I think most people tend to be ignorant of dialectical interplays. And when I say a dialectical interplay, I'm talking about the way in which oppositions are generated so that things occur in tandem, which are their opposites. And so that at the moment here, I'm talking about the moment of most talk about liberty, we're seeing the opportunities for the greatest curtailment of liberty. And much of the modern condition is caught up in what the German philosopher Hegel will call, Hegel is a 19th century philosopher. We'll come back again when we talk about Karl Marx, but in my opinion, a much greater thinker than Karl Marx, and really one of the great philosophers. He talks of the modern self being this divided and unhappy self. And he argues that it's divided because the abstract goals that it sets itself, in turn, which are meant to provide its solace and to provide the contentment it's seeking, the happiness it's seeking, are ultimately the source of its discontents. It's always out of kilter with itself. I won't carry on with that, but in some ways, this is the beginning of that with this declaration. So the law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part personally or through their representative, and it must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishments. The law must prescribe anything. I'm just leaping around here. The law must prescribe only the punishments that are strictly and inevitably necessary, and no one may be punished except by virtue of a law drawn up and promulgated before the offence is committed and legally applied, all very nicely, as every man is presumed innocent until he has been declared guilty. Well, of course, this is exactly what would be torn up with by the Montanars. No one may be served on account of his opinions, even religious ones, as long as the manifestation of such opinions does not interfere with the established law and order. But you see, as soon as you say A, there's two bits here, A and B, the established law and order, that already defines what is doing the disturbing and which opinions can be tolerated or not. And we're living in this now. It's this kind of principle that you can see operative in how people think and talk about how freedom of expression operates today. But you'll see people within universities, in all sorts of forums, want to say that certain opinions interfere with the established law and order. So there's not unmitigated freedom of speech. By the way, I could argue there's never been unmitigated freedom of speech. But what is considered a violation of someone's security, what speech is seen as harmful? Now we use the term hate speech. There's a lot of legislation around hate speech. What we see is that the state has gained. It's increasingly intensified. And I was going to say before, I quoted this earlier in much earlier week, but one of the loyalists in the time of the American Revolution, that is one of them who was against the Patriots, that is that would become who was basically an American who supported the British cause, is reported to have said, I would rather live with one tyrant who is 10,000 miles away than 10,000 tyrants who are 1 mile away. And that is really a fantastic formulation of the way in which some people, at least, who were opposed to what was happening within the French Revolution, saw it. They saw this, and now I'll come back to one of the greatest sociologists and historians, in my opinion, of the 19th century, is a guy called de Tocqueville, and he was writing after the revolutions, throughout from the 1830s on 1850s, and his argument was that freedom and equality, it cannot be undone. We can't simply revive the aristocratic world. But the tendency towards tyranny in freedom and equality is now the major source of concern that we moderns are facing. And I think de Tocqueville is one of the really great political thinkers, very astute. He writes a fantastic book called The Ancient Regime, which if you've got time, read it. It's a great book on the French Revolution. Some of the details are now being criticised by other historians who've got more accurate. But overall, as a general guide, revolution is quite good. Here also, free communication ideas is also being, talked up. Again, I want you to go through these. Here's the right to property, accounting of administration, number 15. No one may deprive of their property unless public necessity legally ascertain. Again, that you say A and you've got B. It's red, but it's black. It depends. None of this, to put it bluntly, none of this stuff, it really mitigates against the will of those that want what they want. All they have to do is reframe what they want in terms of it being a public good. And how do you assess it? Do you always bring it back and have a vote, a plebiscite on it? Well, of course, that's not what governments do. To this day, governments don't do that. There's all sorts of things that transpire in the context of the state services, state behaviours within universities, within schools, within all sorts of legislation even, that never makes its way into what it is that voters, that is into a party platform for voters to participate in. Again, it's just there's so consensuses, elite consensuses form, and this kind of talk does nothing to prevent this kind of consensus. If anything, though, what it does is when there's a group pushing for its interest to get a new consensus, it will use this kind of talk. But it will use this kind of talk. But that doesn't mean that this kind of talk is, strictly speaking, true. And this is, I'll come back to, this is the problem with rights talk. It's a level of generality, a level of abstraction that has a certain appeal and that has efficaciousness or efficacy when it's put in a judicial forum where, again, principle, and here in places like Australia, precedent may matter, but nevertheless, principle is being deployed as a way of getting to the truth of things, when in fact, the serious questions to be had about the character of principle, about the character of the characters that are putting forth the principles. Now, this is part of this legacy of rights talk. Okay, thank you, Claire, for letting me know that. I had received something that there are some, I will just announce this, I'll just make a halt for a second, that some people are finding it difficult to get this. It will be resolved, so they'll be able to join it later. So they will hear this lecture, but perhaps not at the time. Okay. Also from the Constitution of 1791 or 1789, I think. The constitutional, this is from 1791. Yeah. The constitutional monarchy, the sovereignty was situated in the nation, not the crown. The monarch was a salaried civil servant. The crown has powers of suspension, not absolute veto. So these were other changes. So you had the Declaration in 1789, and then in 1791, when you've actually set up a constitutional monarchy, there's various things being opened up. One of the things was the distinction between active citizens and passive citizens. The suffrage was exclusively for males of the minimum age of 25 who paid taxes equivalent to 3 days' wages. Those who could not fulfil tax requirements for active citizenship or civic rights included women but no vote. Okay, so you've got the passive. So women had rights, but didn't have a right to vote. A number of other people who couldn't fulfill it. But what we will see in 1793 is this opens up, that breaks down. But what we will quickly see, what we'll also see, is this didn't really mean a lot to people. That, surprise, surprise, unlike the urbanites, especially who wanted to get specific opportunities flow their way, most people didn't really care as long as they could get certain basic goods, but they weren't interested in a life of endless talk about politics. In Paris, there seemed to be a lot more of it, and some of the other urban centres, but in the main, this idea, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau really central to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's thinking. Remember me saying how Robespierre is so enamored with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thing about Rousseau is he basically thought that people wanted to spend their day talking about politics. And it is true that a certain class of people, the main thing they want to talk about is politics. That's a certain group of people. And there tend to be people with a certain kind of education, a certain kind of set of views that they think if they were taken seriously, then they could fix up the world. But that is by far not the most people. And it certainly wasn't back then. And it's certainly not when you've got people who work on farms and working in the fields and that kind of thing. They don't have the time nor the interest. So this distinction, which you could say was not sufficiently democratic, and it wasn't, begs the call. It really is an instance of the fact that there wasn't such a great interest in everyone participating in politics because, and here's the rub, in politics, compromise is going to be essential. Now, the trajectory of the French Revolution is such that when the Montagnards take over and the Constitution 1793, there's this kind of insane view that, which, remember me saying, in 1789, there's still ways out of this. It moves in this direction, but it recognises that compromise is going to be intrinsic to political life, which is exactly what is being denied by the Jacobin Montagnards of 1793. And in that way, I think they had far more. This is what I call the Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that the whole point about politics was eliminating interests, eliminating differences of interest, that you came to harmony by finding what was general and putting aside your own interests. The counter argument to that is that's an impossibility. The Robespierrean faction and the Montagnard and the revolution, just bring it back a little bit, but the writers of the Constitution of 1793 also believed everything hung around unity. And as I said, what you ended up having was a greater hostility and violence towards anyone who didn't conform. That dialectic of the suffocation of difference through the defense of identity. Okay. In 1791, this woman, Olympe de Gouges, also advocated the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. Now, the reason I bring this up, in England, around much the same time, the daughter of William Godwin, who was quite a famous author, political writer, wrote a book also on the vindication of the rights of women. She was a follower of Rousseau, but Rousseau had never argued for the political rights of women. He had a very patriarchal, conservative view of women's role. Woman was basically there to serve a man. But Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges were two of the earliest feminists. She had also, coming back to de Gouges now, she had been an advocate for the abolition of slavery, but a constitutional monarch, a supporter of the Gironde, and she was guillotined in the Reign of Terror. I don't think it was so much for advocating the rights of women, but more generally for her political views. But the point was that as radical as the Jacobins were, they simply weren't interested. Sorry, the Montagnards were. They simply weren't interested. So in 1793, we have a new constitutional committee, and whereas the National Convention had been mostly Girondes, the expulsion of the Girondes led to a new committee, and that would be led by de Seychelles and included Saint-Just and Couthon. And this would be the beginning of the Terror, and would ultimately lead to the beginning of the Committee of Public Safety. Now, a new constitution was set up. It was approved by popular referendum. But here's the rub. Only 1.7 million voted for it, against it 11,000. 4 million voters abstained. So that is everything I said a slide back or two about the relative indifference of people to politics really hangs upon this in France. That shows you it didn't mean that much. And in the new constitution, there was universal suffrage. It was the people rather than the nation was sovereign. In this respect, this was a very Rousseau move. Rousseau said the people can never devolve its sovereignty. So the people and the nation are one. Unicameral deputies, executive committees. Look, we don't need to really go into this. There are all these constituents, because while all this is happening, the opposite is happening. That is, the power is not extending, it's concentrated into a very, very select few. And that's ultimately why it becomes a dictatorship. So I'm not going to go into that. I want to move briefly, very quickly through this, because I want to talk about Napoleon at least for another 30 or 40 minutes. So this, as I said, this lecture will go over time. Some other articles of the Constitution were that I just want to draw attention to these. Again, please read these. But here in number 96, this is absolutely violated in the trial of Danton and then others. In 109, all Frenchmen are soldiers. I'll get back to that, but what we're seeing, this is what I said, it becomes an armed society. And all of this stuff about rights and popular assembly, blah, 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 you can see it's all hot air. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine this morning. He's a very good, dear friend of mine, and we play music together. And he was saying, which a lot of people think, so this is the reason I'm bringing this up, it's a very commonplace way of thinking. He was saying, well, if enough people, if everybody thought this, then this would happen. If everybody believed X, then Y would happen, because Y is predicated on people believing X and then acting upon doing X. And as I pointed out to him, what people say and what they do is a world apart. There may be all sorts of reasons why what people say and what they do are in disjunction with each other. And and the obvious thing would be they're hypocrites, but no, not at all. That's not what I'm saying. That's not the main reason, at least. I think people often say things and then they absolve themselves in the moment that they say it. You know, how is it possible? Here's another question, and I'll take this from the Marxist tradition. How is it possible that all these people who are not members of what Marx called the industrial proletariat, and this includes Marx himself and Engels himself, how is it possible they become spokesmen of a class that they are not the members? And the answer is because of this disjuncture of narrative. That they perceive themselves as sharing the same interests, but in their actual practice, they don't want to do that. They don't want to be that. In fact, they can't do it. It's too hard. Karl Marx never went to work in a factory for a day in his life. Engels owned a factory. He didn't work in a factory, he owned a factory. And yet his whole theory was about getting rid of capitalists, which would have made him not. That's not just a cheap shot, because it's pretty obvious. But it's an observation that this is commonplace, and it's particularly commonplace in the modern world. In fact, I'll come back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's such an important figure in the setting out of the philosophical ideals of the revolution. Rousseau constantly said one thing and did the other. I've never seen a man in which his image of what was virtuous, his representation of himself as an embodiment of virtue, and his actual practice is so out of kilter. For example, Rousseau writes a book about the education of children. But when he has children, they are all farmed out to an orphanage. He has something like half a dozen or so. They're farmed out to an orphanage. And in those days, kids died very young at orphanages. You know, exhibit 1. Rousseau imagines a world in which basically people spend their lives talking about politics. Now, he liked writing about politics and that, but Rousseau also couldn't stand being with people. In fact, he was a real hypochondriac. He spent some time with David Hume, and David Hume's a great Scotch Enlightenment thinker who was a big fan of Rousseau's thought, ended up thinking Rousseau was a complete nutjob, and so on and so on. You know, I won't carry on. There's this disjuncture, and we see this in this. We see that this disjuncture of what people say and what they do is not thought through at all in this. Now, in 1795, a whole other constitution comes into play. It's a reaction to the Reign of Terror. This is what we were talking about, the Directory. We mentioned the age. This was drafted by CA. That's really interesting. It comes back into play in the Revolution, having written the what is the Third Estate, having been such a prominent figure early in the Revolution, the radical side, and then seeing it all go to shit, and then coming up with this much more conservative. It removes the right of insurrection. You can look at, again, you can look at this. It has very much smaller electoral assembly, but it's about stability. It's wanting to create stability. Okay, you can read all this. Okay, you can just read all this. And again, if we go through the Constitution of 1795, there's certain lines of continuity with the revolution, but including the property. Getting hold of property is a big problem in the revolution because it's got to pay for itself. So initially, as you recall, they seized all these church lands, and then they started seizing the land of aristocrats, and then laws against emigres have been introduced. The Frenchmen. So there's still some. It's not as if every radical inroad of the revolution has been torn up. So but it basically wants to find a way to create calm. You can, again, just read this at your own leisure. I want to get to Napoleon. Okay. So Napoleon seizes power. There had already been a bunch of wars involving France. We talked about the war with Austria and Prussia, which Louis had basically signed off on that. And it was the Gironde, this group, that had pushed for that war. And they had pushed for that war because basically in their own mind, they couldn't see any other response to the French Revolution other than shock horror from the monarchy. Now, eventually that would be the case. But in the first instance, for example, the British were quite happy to see problems in France. They didn't care. Why would that worry them? That's not their problem. This is France, and my enemy's weakness is to my advantage. And that was not uncommon. And again, we must remember, as you recall from the 7 Years' War, the way in which different factions are aligning. One day the Austrians are against the French, another day with them, the same with the Prussians, with the Austrians, and so on. So the geopolitics is one of constant shifting and shape shifting, so to speak. The French certainly believed that that all European powers would be against them, that the idea of a revolution should be globally exported. The fact that Marie Antoinette was the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburg ruler, was also a cause of concern. But they weren't gun hungry to go in, or what's the word? They weren't quick to jump in to do this. Not at all. The revolution would be going on quite a while, a couple of years, before foreign armies start to gather. And obviously, the execution of the king was a step too far. But again, there's toing and froing. So, and in part, that's also because there's other conflicts going on. France has to be seen in the context of other things. In 1787, Russia and Austria were at war with Turkey. Prussia was invading Holland. Prussia and Poland, tensions with Austria. Tensions between Britain and France. Britain and Prussia nearly fought Russia in 1791. So there's these other geopolitical things, which in the minds of the French supporters of the revolution, in which they're, I've said it before, the Parisians always tend to think Paris is the center of the world. So the French thought, what's going on in here? The whole world is quaking with this. And they were speaking in that, I think I may have mentioned, Danton at one point in the convention gets up, or one of the assemblies gets up and says, we will liberate even China. This is a revolution for global export. Everyone will be like this. There had been a revolution in Haiti, so there were obviously some ricochet. But for elsewhere, it's very much geopolitics is normal. France is going through a bit of a chaos. We'll see what happens. And you recall that it's a constitutional monarchy up until the time of the execution of the king. So it's ultimately they're not quick to jump in, the surrounding powers. But the flight to Lorraine, then there's a direct declaration of Pillnitz in 1791. new Habsburg king, Leopold II, Frederick William II, they start calling for a Bourbon restoration. They think they've gone too far. Then ultimately, as we said, it was the war declared by France, even though it was obvious that Austria and Prussia were gathering on the border. And the King of the Drums, I've said all this. In 1793, war is then declared upon Britain and Holland and Spain. And part of this is because the French want to export the revolution, especially in Holland and in Spain. And the Vendéan revolt and other forces against the French, Portugal, Italian princes and states of German Empire are going on. So basically, France is galvanizing its territorial advantage to the best extent it can in the context of this geopolitical upheaval, and also various groups are drawn into France because of, for example, Catholic Spain, the Vendéan revolt, their kind of natural sense of connection. But that's not necessarily. There's various drivers behind each of these wars, and it's not simply abstractly because they're all against a constitutional monarchy being set up, or when Louis is gone. The real question is what is going to happen to their surrounding interests, which is a question of geopolitics. Let me say this better. Geopolitics, the main thing is not going to be who is governing. The main thing is what impact does who is governing have upon my territorial interests. That's a kind of rule of thumb of geopolitics. In 1794, the Russians and Prussians were attacking Poland, and actually, as you may know, Poland disappeared basically from the map throughout the 19th century because of this. And for the Poles, what we'll see is there's very different receptions for Napoleon. For the Spanish and the Russians, Napoleon is a horror. He's not bringing emancipation, he's just bringing nothing but death and horror, even to the people who you think would support him. And Napoleon was very surprised by that. For the Poles, on the other hand, they're very welcoming. They want Napoleon. It's not unlike, we see similar kinds of things in the 20th century. For example, the Ukrainians, they so hated the communists that they welcomed the Hitlerites. Now, the Hitlerites made it very clear that they saw all Slavs as subhumans, which included the Ukrainians. But that didn't, and the same with the Croatians, with the Ustasha in the Second World War, very similar kind of thing. So ideologically, you wouldn't think they would support that group, but they did. And it's the same here, is that depending upon what your interests are and depending upon who your enemy is very much how one was going to respond to Napoleon. So there's a lot of shifting and throwing. In 1795, Germany, Prussia, and Spain lead the first coalition, and then Spain sides with France against the British. And again, you will recall that Spain, France, and Britain, for a very long time, a couple of 100 years, have been caught up in various wars and alliances with each other at different times, but often very much against each other. So, but Spain siding with France when often it sides against Britain. So Spain siding with France, that's also pointing out, see, it's not ideological. Spain does not want a Republican revolution there, but it's quite prepared to side with France against Britain. Napoleon defeats the Austrian Piedmontese force in 1796. Then Austria leads the first coalition, signs a peace treaty with France. There's an Irish rebellion that also seeks to ally with France, but that's defeated by Britain in 1798. There's French victories in Italy. Then Napoleon invades Egypt, and he's going to go all the way to India, but he's had to retreat from Syria. So then there's another coalition. So there's lots of to and froing, and there's lots of moments, and the one constant in all of this is that Napoleon has proven to be a brilliant strategist, a brilliant general, and in the main, France is winning the continental wars. There's moments of victory, moments of defeat, withdrawal, but overall, Britain has the seas. And the Battle of Trafalgar against the French and the Spanish in 1805 only confirmed that. So there was really no way that the French were ever going to get into Britain, not with its sea power. But when it came to land, France was going to be king, and this would impact, and ultimately Britain ruling the seas also impacted upon the resources France could draw from its colonies. And this would, in the longer term, this would hinder the Napoleonic enterprises. So it did matter where they're, getting resources, because merchants and slaves and the slave trade coming from France, from the Indies, from the West Indies, from the West Indies, all that was very economically important to the French. And although initially they had eliminated slavery, Napoleon had reintroduced it, and de facto it was happening anyway. So, but with the British now, in a sense, Napoleon should never have gotten into a war, to put it on the sea war, because the sea war would eventually impact upon the land war. One of the most important things about the French Revolution and the military was the actual constituency of the army. And all the other powers against France were, the officer class came from the aristocracy. Though the lower ranks from the lower classes, they also used mercenaries. Mercenaries, though, are notoriously difficult to trust. Niccolo Machiavelli talks about this in his book, The Prince, written in around 1500. They're not going to give their all. They'll beef with you one moment and against the next. But it was very common for armies to use mercenaries. So you could say the level of loyalty in the armies directed at the French was generally more fragile than what the French displayed. The French had opened up the army. It was no longer led by aristocracy. So now high office in the army was something that anyone could aim for. And in aiming for that, and Napoleon was a perfect example. Here's this guy from Corsica who comes in as a corporal and then is a leading general and then becomes the Emperor of France. Talk about this idea. One might say this is a great, confirmation of the triumphant side of the revolution. Talk about merit gaining prestige, power, and influence and importance. You can see that with Napoleon. Anyway, so what you've got is a democratization of the army, and this also would, when combined with the strategic genius of Napoleon, and he was a strategic genius, he changes the whole way in which warfare is conducted. And what makes it possible, so he basically, in terms of military strategy, what he does is he basically has this core where you have now, instead of much smaller groups, you've got mini armies within the army. So you don't just have all one set of troops working in a certain manner over here, and then they have the cavalry over here, the infantrymen there. A does this, say, and B does this, and that's it. What you've got, you've got the entire group has intermingling, so to speak. You've got the entire composition moving en masse, so the intensification of the sheer numbers of the army and the way in which the division of labour now is so closely aligned, tightly aligned, means it's much more difficult to defeat. So, and the other thing was that the scale of incorporating people into the army it had become a central part of what the revolution was doing, was supplying troops for the army in these wars. It had gone from 156,000 in 1789 to 800,000 in 1794. All of this was an indication of a militarized society, now a militarized society caught up in geopolitical conflicts in which it's an expanding militarized society, driven on by the sentiments of those who are part and parcel of the army, who are reaping the rewards from the army, who don't feel, as many of the officers in more traditional armies, sorry, not officers, of the soldiers in more traditional army, that they are being kept in their place and thus unable to achieve the merit that they would through military prowess if it was simply their prowess that was recognised. Okay. I think the French Revolution is a fantastic illustration of the sentiments that were holding the French nation together. You can read this at your own leisure, but you notice it is a call to arms. It's all about blood. I mean, when the British are sitting around singing "God Save the Queen, long to reign over us," or we're singing "Advance Australia Fair," every time you hear the French national anthem, you're hearing all this blood curdling. It's hilarious, really. I mean, it's still the national anthem. It's basically a blood-letting cry against conspiratorial kings and traitors and vile chains and, you know, our sacred patriotism, the death to your enemies, our triumph and glory, your patricidal kings. So this is what the soldiers are. They've taken this, and this comes from a military song. The French national anthem is a way of cementing national unity. And as you can see, it's a whole militaristic consciousness, revolutionary militaristic. As I said, the French Empire kept growing, lots of victories under Napoleon, and then there were different attempts to try and put an end to it. So there was a Treaty of Amiens in 1802 with the British, but that was ultimately failed. And it basically, Napoleon seems unstoppable. And you can see this from this map. You can see he's moved, he's got control of Spain, he's got, you know, it's just, and you've got the Empire of France, but you've moved right into Italy, into much of Germany, into parts of Poland. You know, you see how successful Napoleon has been. And up until this point, it's been, you know, it's not since something like the Roman Empire that you've seen something on Western soil. Even it's, I think I'm right. That's maybe the Charlemagnian Empire. I'd have to have the two maps there to see which was bigger. But then you've got, if you take states allied with Napoleon later, so you end up having the Austrians allied with it, and the Kingdom of Norway and Denmark allied with Napoleon. And then you see the states against it. By the end, you've got Portugal, you've got the United Kingdom, you've got Sweden and the Russian Empire. Ultimately, it'd be Russia that would do him in, but also, as I said, Britain's rule of the seas also makes a difference. Ultimately, Great Britain gets back into the fray, and when it comes back into the fray after having basically tried to get Napoleon to agree to hold on, and then in refusing to do that, they eventually go in when Malta, he goes into Malta, and that's just too much. It's a little bit like in the Second World War, how the British watched Hitler go into Austria, go into Czechoslovakia, but when it came to Poland, Churchill said enough's enough. So here we have basically blue, red, French Empire in blue, and that includes Allied states, coalition in red. We see how successful Napoleon has been. But he wants to go into Russia. And basically, if he's got Russia, he's got all of Europe. Then Portugal won't hold out. You know, that's just momentary, and it's got the British helping them there anyway on the coast. So sort of a bit of help. But in the main, it's Russia is the big prize. And it's a disaster. The campaign is a disaster. Like Hitler, he doesn't put enough forethought into the coming winter. It takes too long. He's not adequately prepared for the Russian tactics of withdraw, bring you go further into the territory. So one of the things about Russia, it's a very easy country to get into. This has been part of the geopolitical thinking and military thinking of Russia since ever. And that is that it doesn't have the kind of natural boundaries and borders that make it, as I said, inaccessible. Not really that natural. It's easy. You just go. But once you're in there, it's very big territory if you can be drawn further in. And the Russian resistance can keep you there until the seasons turn the right way around. Then you're in trouble. And that's what Napoleon loses 5 out of 6 of his soldiers. He goes in with the greatest army in Europe, and he comes out with a ragtag of starving, dispirited soldiers. You can just, imagine in your head, they're going in, singing the Marseillaise. They're absolutely sure the world is theirs. Once they got Russia, what does Portugal and Sicily or, matter? What do they matter? But, or Sardinia, what does that matter? These other little places like Netherlands or Liechtenstein. And the question is, well, there won't be anything left. And that's ultimately, Napoleon will be defeated. He once said that the most important thing for a general to have is, the commander to have, is lucky generals. And it was really like his luck had turned. So he gets exiled to Elba, but then he comes back for 100 days. But what happens? This time there's a resounding defeat at Waterloo. It's all over. Okay, let's sum up Napoleon and as a set of paradoxes. He was a product of the revolution. Indeed, he saw himself as someone that was carrying forward the revolution. We talked earlier about his role in bringing together the legal system, and the education system, 2 of the greatest of Napoleon's achievements. But he had welcomed nobles back into the military and administration. We recall even the Directory wanted to not let emigres back and give them property back. He restored titles of the nobility. And 3,000 nobles, some of whom had been nobles prior to the revolution. So he restored titles and let old ones back. He became an emperor. The whole point. You've got a constitutional monarchy, and now you've got an emperor. You can see, wow, that's and even having more authority because the state had become more consolidated. The powers of the state. It's become far more centralized than it ever was under Louis XVI. I meant, when I said a constitutional monarchy, obviously the first phase of the revolution. But if we go back then even before the revolution, we see that Louis's power was far more compromised, far less absolutist than Napoleon's power. And in part that's because the state itself was far less centralized, far less unified, far less orchestrated. The energies of the state were far less orchestrated. So Napoleon had really become the emperor of a modern state, of one of the very first modern states. We might say in the United States you had a modern state, but this was now the first European modern state, but an imperial state. And the fate of France would move from being, it goes from restoration to republic to imperial before it comes back to republic. That's incredible. It repeats its whole history throughout the 19th century. It repeats the three that lead from the, as I said, to republic to empire, and prior to that to with the restoration from monarchical government to. He had also basically turned the conquered state into monarchical vassals. Now, one of the other things, and look, on the one hand, Napoleon is presenting himself as a great emancipator, but one of the fundamental tactics of Napoleon's deployment of the army, and the way he had to do it because of the scale of troops he had at his command and the great big military corps he had, in operation, is they would basically go into a country, and if the peasants didn't hate them at the beginning, they hated them at the end. And they hated them at the end because they were the source of the food supply. He wasn't now dependent upon peasants in France providing the food. Wherever they were, the crops would be taken. So again, you can imagine that peasant nations like Russia, they didn't go, oh, great, it's Napoleon. Napoleon's here, that's fantastic. He's going to eat up all our wheat so we won't have anything. He'll pay us a bit, but, not much. That was the thinking. And at the same time, he's actually got vassals. He's making these imperial appointments. He's setting up a dynasty. It's a family. So, great paradox. The reason I just give you this slide is simply because Spain, again, Napoleon had thought Spain would only welcome him. He thought, people would be wanting to be liberated from the monarchical burdens, and it wasn't true. The wars in Spain are all, it's caught up by Goya. Goya, by the way, was a Republican, so he was not a friend at all of the monarchy of Spain, of the Spanish crown, not a friend at all. But his depiction of the Napoleonic conquest of Spain is a horror show, and it etched itself. So here is someone who you think would be a natural supporter of Napoleon doing these drawings, which, if anything, they galvanise people against Napoleon. They show the horror of the Napoleon. Now, all sorts of unintended consequences follow from this, and so in this sense, they're part of the meaning of the revolution. First of all, it ended up strengthening, not weakening, the British Empire, because France would be displaced from the Caribbean by the British, and this, and they would also capture French posts in India, the East Indies Company. There was a French East Indies Company, and they would then also capture the Cape of Southern Africa, and they overran the Dutch East Indian Company. So all of this would strengthen. On the other hand, it did create a trigger for the Spanish colonies to become independent from Spain. Ultimately, this would weaken Spanish imperial power. It create a whole other set of problems and circumstances in Latin America, and in North America, there would be a land grab of Mexican territory in the midst of their own conflicts. It triggered independence movements in the Balkans. Again, very unintended consequence. It was a trigger for German and Italian nationalism. there's very little sense, and certainly the kind of German nationalism you get in the 18th century is not at all of a militaristic sense. You can see this if you read characters like Johann Georg Herder or what Kant has to say about the Germans. And then when you're looking at stuff written after Napoleon's conquest of German principalities, you can see there's a real push for German national unity. Similarly in Italy. Italy had been forever ununified, but in the 18th century it becomes unified. But basically the template now is the nation. And so, in a sense, Napoleon has been successful in exporting this central idea of the French Revolution, the idea of the nation, but it's at the expense of Germany, and at the expense of France. And when the German Empire builds up, you think of the 1870 war against France, the Franco-Prussian War led by Bismarck, the First and Second World War, you'll see, well, the monster that Napoleon created. His defeat would also overshadow French and European politics for the next century. I've mentioned this before. I mentioned how the consequences in how France, what it would move through. I'm going to sum up now. So, as I said, I was going a bit longer today, but a little less long than I thought I might go, so I'm very pleased with that. Pat myself on the back for getting up to speed. Let's sum up the meaning of the French Revolution. First of all, this was the consolidation of the empowerment of the professional classes. It meant getting rid of what was essentially a very obsolete and complicated system of not only raising taxes and financial system, but also gaining certain kinds of power in France. It became streamlined, it became simplified. It also got rid of the guilds completely. So it got rid of all these kind of archaic practices. In a word, the French Revolution was a period of rapid modernization, of a kind of to and froing, of confusion, of swarm, but now the majority of office holders in revolutionary political bodies were lawyers, doctors, journalists, teachers, the kind of people we see occupy Parliament today. The crowd have become a significant political player. The masses. This is still something that the masses are very often relatively dormant in liberal democratic societies, but there's all sorts of times when the panic of the masses and the orchestration of the energy of mass politics comes into play. In the main, I would say it was the National Socialists, the Italian fascists, and the communists that played upon the energy of the masses much more, even though, as you can see, they were dictatorial. But that dialectic of dictator and mass politics is a natural dialectic, I'll almost say, that the mass becomes mass through a certain kind of dictatorial set of principles being agreed upon and then being enacted. The franchise would eventually become expanded. It would be contracted in the first instance and so on, but ultimately, in the middle of the 19th century especially, and I'm not so much thinking of France where you had the return of the empire, but elsewhere in Western Europe, there's all these liberal revolutions are conducted, and they're conducted with the mindset, the filtering systems, the kind of appeals that were part and parcel of the rights talk of the French Revolution. So I was very critical in talking about that rights talk earlier, but that's when I'm wearing a sort of detailed philosopher's cap in terms of certain anomalies that occur. On the other hand, it would become very effective in galvanizing the middle class to gain political power. And ultimately, there are many, many advantages about liberal democracy and a middle class set of politics. I don't want to deny that. That was an insight in pre-modern politics recognized by Aristotle, And one of the reasons, and he just recognized that if you can have a middle class involved in political action, then you're more likely to get a set of policies that there's a general consensus around rather than a more divisive. That's true up to a point, but I'll talk later in the semester about our modern predicament, which I think is somewhat complicates that picture. Also, what had been set up was that the role and functions of the state had become much stronger, often dictatorial. I elaborated upon that about an hour back. A new political mythology gets set up. That's a whole set of terms and references. The people, the nation, the general will. There's a faith in social and political progress. To this day, we speak of a policy being progressive, that it's an improvement upon things, it's better. And we speak as if the nature of politics is to deliver ever more free or ever more equal policies. So we use a whole, I should have put freedom and equality there. We use a set of reference points that were intrinsic to the revolution. When I use the word mythology, I'm using that in a very specific way. The word myth is an ancient Greek word for story. It's a story we tell ourselves. It's a set of stories we tell. They're abstract stories, so they're different from other kinds of stories. But the further you dig philosophically into these concepts, you realize there's a problem waiting you in the labyrinth. It's not just, oh, freedom is good, equality is good. No, it's not like that. The more you squeeze these concepts, it's not, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying opposition to freedom is good, opposition to equality is good. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that these words they're labyrinthal, and the further you go in, the more you see some kind of unexpected, monstrous surprises awaiting you. The national revolutions of independence would be decisive in shaping the 19th and indeed much of the 20th century. A large part of the story of the 20th century, and when I first did this, thought about doing this course, I thought I would have time to, which turned out not to be the case, to do a lot of stuff on the anti-colonial revolts of the 20th century, which all are basically prefigured by the nationalist sentiments that become consolidated in the French Revolution. Also, the dialectic of nation and empire had been set, and we can see that with France itself, from nation to empire. And now we see the EU trying to embody this contradiction. It tried to draw nations into what is essentially a new kind of empire. Political parties were being established. We set the language of the left and the language of the right. That comes into play now. And there had been Whigs and Tories in Great Britain, so I'm not saying it's unique, but there's a kind of the expectations of conformity to an ideological program are certainly intensified by the Montagnard especially. And once that happens, there you've got really all the elements in place for a one-party dictatorial state, which we'll find in the Russian Revolution with the Leninists. The intelligentsia have taken over the role of those who prayed. For me, this is really, really important. And it's a kind of thing most people have never thought about, because most people don't really think that historically about politics, or anthropologically or sociologically. But the reason the enlightened philosophers were so anti-clerical, anti-superstition, anti the church was twofold. On the one hand, they see that the stories they're telling stunt human intelligence. Two, they think that the storytellers who are doing the stunting of intelligence have to go. And Ergo, the new storytellers, because we need stories to galvanize people into a collective purpose, into our nation, that the new storytellers have to be people who broker in ideas, who broker in principles, who are people that dream up things like the rights of man and understand that and instruct them. So rights, equality, freedom, these become the seals of sources of appeal. They're moral and political. They no longer have any religious dimension. And yet, as one great critic of the revolution observed, and he's a German contemporary, I mentioned Immanuel Kant, his name is Johann Georg Hamann, he's actually one of my favorite writers and thinkers. And he basically says, you know, these new metaphysicians of the Enlightenment, these new philosophers, what they ask what is philosophical about religion. But what I ask, I'm paraphrasing, what I ask is what is religious about philosophy. And I think that's really quite genius, because you'll start to see that there's all sorts of features about the intelligentsia, and the intelligentsia are going to play a huge part when we discuss the Russian Revolution. If anything, they play a bigger role in preparing for the Russian Revolution than they do even in the French Revolution. That the intelligentsia are people who are really driven by their own sense of faith, and the question is, well, is it defensible? Is it really true? That's a serious question, which I won't be answering in this course, but in various writings of mine I address things like that. Ideology, and this is what we're going to see next. There's a break next week, but when we come back, we will enter the 19th century, which in many ways is, amongst other things, the age of ideology. And we will be focusing upon the ideologies of socialism and communism. But that will become a crucial feature of political disputation. Different phases and elements of the revolution provide the embryonic forms, as I've said, of the different ideological differentiations which would be played out through the 19th and 20th century. And basically the basis for a secular state and secular society is set. And once that's set, everything is changed. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to reading your work. And I am now exactly where I want to be in terms of this course. So enjoy your break.